June 6, 1944, 06:30 a.m. The cold wind off the English Channel carried the smell of salt and cordite. Gray waves slammed into steel landing craft, each one packed with young Americans gripping their rifles, lips pale with fear. The ramp dropped, and hell opened. Machine gun fire stitched across the surf, tearing through water and flesh alike. Men stumbled forward, dragging each other through the rising tide. Helmets bobbed like stones in the bloodied foam. Above them, on the high bluffs of Normandy, German officers watched through binoculars, smirking. They had called these men amateurs, factory workers, farmhands, students, soldiers of an industrial nation that, to Nazi eyes, knew only machines, not war. But beneath the chaos, something unseen was taking shape, a relentless will to keep moving forward, yard by yard, under impossible fire. As the sun rose over Omaha Beach, the arrogance that had ruled Europe for years began to tremble. The laughter on the cliffs would not last long. 4 years before the storming of Omaha Beach, Europe had already bowed to the might of the Third Reich. In the spring of 1940, Hitler's blitzkrieg shattered France in 6 weeks, a campaign that humiliated the world's most celebrated army. Across the Channel, Britain braced for invasion, and from the Rhine to the Pyrenees, the Nazi eagle spread its wings. To many in the German high command, it seemed no army could match them. Their tactics, fast, coordinated, terrifyingly efficient, had rewritten the rules of modern war. The Wehrmacht's confidence hardened into conviction. Their officers, molded by years of disciplined hierarchy, began to believe they were not just soldiers, but a superior breed of warriors. Then came the Americans. Across the Atlantic, the United States was still seen as a nation of factories and movie screens. Industrially powerful, yes, but untested. When America joined the war in December 1941, German commanders dismissed them with a single phrase: "The Americans have equipment, not experience." To Hitler's generals, the U.S. Army was a patchwork of amateurs, men driven by production lines, not battlefield instincts. "They will fight like businessmen," one German officer joked. Efficient, but predictable. By 1942, that confidence began to show cracks. The Eastern Front consumed divisions by the hundreds. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, had promised a swift victory. Instead, it became a bottomless pit of blood and frost. Stalingrad, Kursk, Leningrad, words that turned German optimism into dread. Yet in the West, the illusion of control remained. Even as Allied bombers darkened the skies over the Ruhr and Hamburg, the Wehrmacht trusted its fortresses, its doctrines, its experience. They saw the Americans enter combat in North Africa and Sicily, and they laughed again. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, Green American units were routed by seasoned German veterans. It confirmed their bias. These newcomers were brave, perhaps, but naive. Rommel himself noted in his diary that the Americans still have much to learn. The laughter in Berlin grew louder, but the Americans did learn, faster than anyone expected. They rebuilt command structures, rewrote field manuals, replaced weak leadership with men who adapted under fire. Eisenhower emerged not as a conqueror, but as a coordinator, a man who united British precision, American industry, and a global sense of purpose. While Germany's war machine was stretched thin across continents, the United States was becoming an arsenal unlike any the world had seen. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle roared day and night. Every minute, new jeeps, tanks, and aircraft rolled out. Logistics became a weapon, and the U.S. Army mastered it. Behind the front lines, entire ports, roads, and depots were built from scratch in England. Millions of tons of supplies, fuel, rations, ammunition waited for a day that would decide the war's future. The British called it Operation Overlord. The Germans, watching from their bunkers, called it a fantasy. They believed the English Channel was impregnable. Hitler had ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a 2,400-mile chain of bunkers, minefields, and artillery stretching from Norway to the Bay of Biscay. Under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, engineers transformed Europe's western coast into a fortress. To the German mind, it was a wall against chaos, against industrial amateurs who could never endure the disciplined fury of the Wehrmacht. But arrogance, like concrete, can crack under pressure. As Rommel inspected the defenses in early 1944, he noted something unsettling: a quiet efficiency in the enemy's buildup across the channel. Thousands of landing craft, airfields filled with paratroopers, and coded messages the Abwehr couldn't decipher. Still, the Nazi command laughed it off. "They will come to Calais," they insisted. They would never dare land at Normandy. They were wrong. And when the first American boots hit Omaha Beach, the myth of the invincible German soldier would face its reckoning. By early 1944, Europe stood on the edge of a decision. In the east, the Red Army was pushing westward with unstoppable momentum. In Italy, Allied troops clawed their way through mountains and minefields toward Rome. But the heart of Hitler's empire, France, remained untouched. To win the war, the Allies needed a western front. And to open it, they would have to perform the impossible: cross a stormy channel, land hundreds of thousands of men on hostile shores, and break through the most fortified coastline in history. It would be called Operation Overlord. For months, the Allied command, Eisenhower, Montgomery, Bradley, and Lee-Mallory, planned in total secrecy. British fields filled with American divisions, camps disguised as small towns, harbors converted into launching points for an invasion no one had ever attempted. But the Allies knew they couldn't just surprise Germany. They needed to fool them completely. The deception plan, Operation Fortitude, was a masterpiece of wartime illusion. Fake radio traffic, wooden tanks, inflatable aircraft, and entire phantom divisions were positioned across southeastern England. General George S. Patton, known and feared by the Germans, was placed in command of a fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group, aimed directly at Pas-de-Calais. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed dummy camps, fake ships, and artificial oil storage depots. Every detail reinforced the lie: the invasion would come at Calais, the shortest route across the Channel. Hitler's intelligence chiefs believed it completely. Normandy, to them, was a diversion at best, a place to watch, not defend with their full strength. The success of this deception would decide the fate of thousands. While German generals mocked the Americans, Dwight D. Eisenhower carried a weight heavier than any weapon. He was not a battlefield commander, but a strategist of unity. He managed rival egos, balanced political demands, and planned the largest amphibious operation in history. Every decision, weather, timing, tides, carried the weight of the free world. On the eve of June 1944, 1944, storms battered the Channel. Waves surged, winds screamed. His meteorologists warned of disaster if they sailed now. Eisenhower delayed, one of the hardest calls of his career. Then a brief window appeared. The weather would calm just enough. On June 6th, he looked at his commanders and said quietly, "Okay, let's go." It was the calmest statement ever made before the storm of history. Across the water, the German defenses waited, confident and complacent. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox, had been given responsibility for the Atlantic Wall months earlier. But by June 1944, he was in Germany, visiting his wife for her birthday. He believed, like most of the High Command, that bad weather would prevent any landing. In their bunkers, The defenders passed time in routine. Artillery crews maintained their guns. Machine gunners cleaned their belts. Officers inspected rations and maps. To them, the idea of an American assault at Normandy seemed absurd. Meanwhile, their intelligence system, once the pride of the Reich, had collapsed into dysfunction. Abwehr reports were outdated. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights were nearly impossible due to Allied air dominance, and Hitler's decision-making had grown erratic. He refused to release panzer divisions without his personal approval, even if an invasion occurred. So when the first Allied ships appeared on the horizon, many German observers still believed it was a feint. In southern England, the night of June 5th fell silent except for engines. 5,000 ships assembled. Destroyers, transports, and landing craft stretching from horizon to horizon. In the air, 13,000 aircraft roared to life. Thousands of paratroopers tightened their harnesses, ready to drop behind enemy lines. At 4:00 a.m., Allied bombers began pounding coastal defenses. The horizon lit up with fire. A man-made dawn over the sea. Naval guns followed, thundering across the water. The German coastal troops braced, confused. Reports flooded in. Enemy fleet sighted. Explosions near Caen. Troops landing near Virville-sur-Mer. Still, many officers hesitated. Some believed it was a diversion, still expecting the real blow to fall at Calais. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. The Atlantic Wall, built on arrogance and concrete, was about to meet a storm it was never truly designed to stop. As dawn broke over Normandy, and the first American soldiers began stepping into the surf of Omaha Beach, the illusion of German invincibility prepared to collapse. The sea was black before dawn, a shifting, endless plain of cold waves. Inside each landing craft, American soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, packed so tightly they could feel the trembling of the man beside them. Some prayed, others vomited into their helmets. The air reeked of diesel and nerves. They had trained for months, rehearsed landings on English shores, crawled through barbed wire, memorized maps of beaches they had never seen, but nothing prepared them for what waited ahead. Private Harold Baumgarten, a 19-year-old medic from New York, later recalled, "It was dark, but you could see flashes. Every flash meant someone was dying." As the boats neared Omaha Beach, machine gun bursts from the bluffs tore through the water. Men jumped too early, sinking under the weight of their gear. Others made it to shore, dragging comrades who no longer moved. Officers shouted through the chaos, voices swallowed by gunfire. Fear was everywhere, but so was something stronger. A grim determination, born not from pride, but from necessity. Every man knew that if the beach failed, the war would stall. The free world depended on those who could crawl forward another foot, despite everything screaming to stop. The Germans would soon learn amateurs can't endure this long. Professionals might, but so can the desperate, the determined, and the brave. High above the beach, inside concrete bunkers carved into the cliffs, German soldiers peered through firing slits at the unfolding chaos. To them, it first appeared as a massacre. They watched American landing craft burn, soldiers scatter, and bodies litter the surf. Some laughed, convinced that the invasion was over before it began. To the German Coastal Command, this was proof that their years of preparation, their Atlantic Wall, had worked. Captain Fritz Siegel, manning a machine gun in Widerstands Nest 62, later described it. "We saw them falling in waves. It was impossible to believe they could keep coming. But what the Germans failed to see was what those waves meant. For every man cut down, another came forward. For every landing craft destroyed, 5 more pressed through the smoke. The Americans were not retreating. They were learning, adapting, and using every inch of cover to survive. As German officers radioed back to command, they expected reinforcements, armored divisions, or air support. None came. Hitler was asleep, and no one dared wake him. Orders for tank deployment were withheld until he personally approved them. By the time he did, the tide and the battle had already turned. The laughter in the bunkers faded. The amateurs were not breaking. They were advancing. Omaha was never supposed to be this hard. American planners had divided the 5 invasion beaches into sectors, each with a specific purpose. Utah, to the west, would see a relatively easy landing. Omaha, however, was a fortress. The Germans had chosen well. The beach was 6,000 yards wide, overlooked by steep bluffs and riddled with concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and interlocking fields of fire. Every approach was zeroed in with pre-calculated artillery coordinates. As the first waves landed, naval bombardments failed to destroy the German fortifications. Smoke obscured the targets. Many shells overshot. The result: when American troops hit the sand, the defenses were untouched. Pinned by fire, soldiers used the bodies of their fallen comrades as cover. Engineers crawled through mines and barbed wire, desperately clearing paths. Radios failed. Commanders lost contact. In the chaos, leadership dissolved. But initiative was born. Small groups began acting on instinct. They crawled up the cliffs, using demolition charges to silence bunkers one by one. Platoons merged, split, and merged again, each man improvising survival. The Germans had planned for an organized army. What they faced instead was something unpredictable: chaos that refused to die. By mid-morning, the tactics of desperation began turning into momentum. Omaha was still a slaughterhouse, but one slowly tilting toward the invaders. Behind every step on Omaha Beach was the power of industrial war. While the Germans had relied on fixed defenses, the Allies brought mobility and innovation. From the sea came the Higgins boats, flat-bottomed landing craft that could skim the shallows and drop men directly onto sand. Designed by an American boat builder from Louisiana, they became the unsung workhorses of D-Day. Supporting them were DD tanks, amphibious Shermans fitted with canvas skirts and propellers. Many sank before reaching shore, victims of rough waves. But those that made it provided crucial fire support, turning bunkers into rubble. Overhead, Allied aircraft dominated the skies. Fighter bombers strafed roads and bridges, cutting off German reinforcements. Naval destroyers moved dangerously close to the shore, firing directly into the cliffs at point-blank range. A suicidal act of precision and courage. It was not elegance that won the beach. It was engineering and logistics, the raw ability to move, adapt, and supply under pressure. The Germans mocked American industry, calling it mechanical warfare without spirit. But on June 6th, those machines became lifelines. Every landing craft, every tank, every radio operator became part of a living system, a fusion of man and machine that turned chaos into victory. By mid-morning, smoke choked the coastline. The sand was littered with wreckage, metal, flesh, and courage fused into one. Yet amid the ruin, the Americans were not retreating. They were reorganizing. The Germans still believed they were winning. They had no idea that the amateurs had already begun climbing their walls. Leadership on June 6, 1944, existed in two opposite worlds. In one, Dwight D. Eisenhower sat quietly in his headquarters in Portsmouth, England, his face calm but unreadable. In the other, Adolf Hitler lay asleep at his mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden. Unreachable, unawakened, and unwilling to face reality. Eisenhower's leadership had never been about charisma or theatrics. He was not a battlefield commander like Patton or Montgomery. His genius lay in harmony, balancing nations, egos, and plans too massive for any one man to control. When D-Day began, he had already prepared a handwritten note, accepting full responsibility in case of failure. "If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone," it read. Across Europe, German command was paralyzed by fear of Hitler's temper. No general dared act without explicit approval. When reports of the landings reached Berlin, officers hesitated, convinced this was a diversion. Even Rommel's deputy requested permission to move panzer divisions toward Normandy, but the order was delayed for hours. Hitler finally awoke after 10 a.m. and refused to release armor until he confirmed the invasion's true location. That hesitation sealed their fate. While Eisenhower's forces advanced through a structure of trust and initiative, Hitler's empire choked on its own chain of command. In that contrast, calm responsibility versus delusional control, lay the moral center of D-Day. Beneath every uniform was a man facing his own conscience. For the Americans, the invasion was more than orders. It was a duty born from belief. Many had grown up in peace, sons of farmers, teachers, and factory workers. They had crossed an ocean not for conquest, but for liberation. Their mission was simple, brutal, and just: to end tyranny. Letters found later in the pockets of fallen soldiers spoke of mothers, wives, and prayers. One wrote, "If I die tomorrow, tell Dad I didn't run." Another carried a folded church pamphlet from Kansas that read, "Fear not." On the German side, faith had turned into fatalism. Many coastal defenders were not SS elites, but ordinary soldiers, conscripts, older men, or Eastern volunteers pressed into service. They fought because orders demanded it, not because they believed in Hitler's dream. Some fought bravely, others hesitated. Few still believed in victory. The difference was invisible in combat, but profound in purpose. The Americans fought toward something: home, freedom, the idea of an end. The Germans fought away from something: punishment, betrayal, collapse. That moral divergence would soon echo through the battle. The side that believed in something beyond survival would endure longer than the one that fought only to delay defeat. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the Wehrmacht as the perfect machine: disciplined, invincible, unstoppable. But at Omaha Beach, that illusion began to shatter. As the morning dragged on, reports from observation posts turned frantic. The Americans are inside the wire. The bunkers are being overrun. We're losing the heights. Commanders couldn't comprehend it. How could raw recruits, soaked, terrified, and disorganized, possibly breach fortified positions defended by veterans? The answer lay in psychology. Arrogance had numbed German adaptability. They were trained to execute, not improvise; to follow, not anticipate. Their system depended on perfection. Chaos broke it. The Americans, by contrast, were raised on improvisation. Farmers turned soldiers, engineers turned sappers, men used to fixing problems, not waiting for permission. On Omaha Beach, where every plan failed, that mindset became their greatest weapon. As German positions began falling one by one, disbelief spread faster than panic. Many soldiers kept firing long after their flanks had collapsed, refusing to accept the impossible. For the first time, the Wehrmacht, once the teacher of modern war, became the student of defeat. And above it all, on the cliffs of Normandy, German officers who once laughed at the amateurs watched their guns go silent. The tide of history was turning against them, not through overwhelming genius, but through human persistence. Every great battle hides what statistics cannot show: the silence afterward. By noon on June 6th, parts of Omaha Beach resembled a graveyard. Waves washed over helmets, rifles, and bodies half buried in the sand. The wind carried no sound of laughter anymore, only the crack of distant rifles and the moan of the wounded. For the Germans, Realization came slowly. Reports up the chain of command spoke of heavy resistance and loss of communication. No one dared to write the truth that their Atlantic wall was bleeding to death under the boots of the very men they had mocked. For the Americans, victory was not celebration. It was exhaustion. Survivors sat behind the first ridgeline, trembling, unable to speak. They had won the impossible, but at a cost too heavy to comprehend. Each side faced silence, one born from shame, the other from loss. But in that silence, history shifted. The age of German arrogance was ending, and a new power was emerging, not out of glory, but out of endurance. By the afternoon of June 6th, the amateurs had climbed the cliffs, destroyed the bunkers, and secured the beachhead. The German laughter that once echoed across Europe had turned into disbelief, and then into silence. The first wave hit the beach at 06:30 a.m. The sea was a field of fire. Mortar shells churned the waves into red spray. The roar of machine guns mixed with the screams of engines and men. Landing craft exploded before they reached the sand. Bodies drifted in the tide, tangled in life jackets and gear. The men of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and the 29th Infantry Division were the first to land. They stepped into waist-deep water, many already bleeding before they took 3 steps forward. The weight of their packs dragged some to the bottom. Those who made it to the beach found no shelter, only shingle and open sand. The pre-landing bombardment, meant to neutralize the German defenses, had missed nearly every bunker. The air bombardment, too, had overshot, dropping its payload inland. The result? The cliffs loomed intact, and the guns atop them were fully operational. From the German strongpoints, Widerstands Nestor, resistance nests, the defenders unleashed an unbroken wall of fire. MG-42 machine guns fired 1-200 rounds per minute, cutting through lines of men like blades through grass. Mortar crews dropped shells rhythmically, methodically. The Americans were trapped in a death zone. Water behind them, bullets ahead. Lieutenant Colonel George Taylor shouted to his pinned men, "There are 2 kinds of people on this beach, those who are dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here!" But there was nowhere to go. Within minutes, the carefully drawn plans dissolved. Companies landed in the wrong sectors, some more than a kilometer off target. Radios were destroyed by water. Officers killed before they could issue a single order. Engineers carrying demolition charges were wiped out before reaching the wire. Tanks meant to support the infantry sank in the rough surf, victims of misjudged tides and high waves. On the German side, the view was almost clinical. Through periscopes and slits, they watched the Americans flounder. Some defenders joked that it was a fish shoot. Others, hardened veterans of Russia, stayed silent, knowing that a cornered enemy can become the most dangerous of all. By 07:15, the beach was chaos. Men clung to the sand in clusters, unable to move. Medics crawled between them, dragging the wounded by their web belts. Ammunition ran low, rifles jammed with sand. The incoming tide began to reclaim the dead. It seemed the invasion might fail here, at Omaha. But amid the carnage, something began to shift. Individual soldiers, sergeants, corporals, even privates, started making decisions no plan had written for them. They realized that to survive, they had to move. Small groups began to crawl toward the base of the cliffs. Engineers used Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes packed with explosives, to blast narrow passages through the wire. Riflemen followed, sprinting between bursts of fire, diving behind obstacles, hauling wounded comrades with them. Captain Joe Dawson, leading a company near Vierville-sur-Mer, spotted a natural gully leading up the bluff. He rallied whoever was close, infantry, engineers, even stray medics, and charged upward through smoke and rubble. It was madness, but it worked. One by one, the men clawed their way up the cliffs, grenades in hand, until they reached the first trench. The German defenders above were stunned. Their bunkers had been designed to resist frontal assaults, not attacks from behind. One machine gun nest fell silent, then another. Within minutes, what had seemed like certain victory turned into sudden confusion. By 08:08 a.m., the noise on Omaha was changing. The steady, rhythmic crack of German fire began to break apart, interrupted by explosions from inside their own defenses. Smoke drifted upward from the cliffs, where Americans were now fighting their way through the trenches. For the first time, the German officers realized that the tide of battle, both literal and symbolic, was turning. Their firing lanes were collapsing. Their ammunition was running low. Radio communication with higher command was spotty, and artillery support was silent. But the Americans were still coming, crawling, limping, sometimes dragging themselves forward. Some fought with rifles, others with bare hands. Leadership had dissolved, but courage had multiplied. One German gunner later admitted, "We thought they would break and run." But they did not stop. They kept coming, even through the bodies of their own. That sight, men advancing through fire, smoke, and death, marked the end of German certainty. The amateurs were refusing to die by the rules. At 08:00, the beach was still chaos, but now it was living chaos. Naval destroyers, acting without orders, had closed to within 1,000 yards of shore, firing point-blank into the bluffs to suppress German guns. Each blast shook the cliffs, sending dirt and debris cascading onto the bunkers. On the sand below, American soldiers huddled behind wreckage, landing craft, steel hedgehogs, bodies, and looked up at the smoke-thickened sky. Through it, the silhouettes of comrades climbing appeared like ghosts. The impossible was happening, step by step. In Berlin, no one yet knew. In the bunkers, disbelief spread like contagion. And on the beach, in the middle of that inferno, the U.S. Army was being reborn, not in training grounds or parades, but in blood and grit. What began as a massacre was slowly, brutally, becoming a resurrection. The beach was not yet won, but by 08:00 a.m., something irreversible had begun. The turning of the tide. The next hours would decide not just Omaha Beach, but the future of Europe. By mid-morning, the tide had risen high enough to flood the beach with debris and the dead. The air smelled of cordite, sea salt, and smoke. Every inch of sand had been fought for, every crater filled with blood and shattered helmets. But now, in the shattered silence between bursts of gunfire, came the sound that changed everything. Movement. Small American units, once isolated and pinned, were now advancing inland through the gullies and breaches blasted open by engineers. Captain Dawson's men near Vierville had reached the crest. Farther east, Lieutenant Spaulding's platoon from the 116th Infantry found another path upward, crawling through mud and thorn. In these narrow, twisting draws, the Germans' overlapping fire fields failed them. Their machine guns couldn't depress low enough. Their mortars couldn't adjust quickly. Above the beach, the defenders in each wider stand's nest began to realize they were alone. Communications were gone. The channels to regimental headquarters were silent. Artillery observers couldn't reach their guns inland. The order that had once synchronized the Atlantic Wall was dissolving into static. At 09:00 a.m., American destroyers USS Carmack, USS McCook, and USS Doyle broke formation and raced toward the coast. Ignoring the depth warnings, their captains steered within 1,000 yards of the bluffs, close enough for machine gun bullets to rattle off their decks. They opened fire with 5-inch guns, pounding the German strongpoints one by one. Each salvo tore open concrete casemates that had survived aerial bombing hours earlier. For the men on the ground, the thunder of those guns was the sound of salvation. They were firing for us, one private wrote later, and we felt the beach breathe again. By 09:30, the first German bunkers began to fall. Sergeant William Cullen's squad reached the rear of Widerstand's Nest 62, tossing grenades into the narrow firing slits. Smoke and dust billowed upward. When it cleared, the machine gun that had killed dozens fell silent. Nearby, another assault team under Lieutenant John Spaulding cleared a trench with bayonets and rifle fire, capturing 10 stunned German soldiers who had believed the beach was still under control. The Americans were now fighting inside the defenses that had been designed to stop them. They turned captured MG-42s against the next positions along the ridge, leapfrogging forward in short, brutal bursts. At 10:00 a.m., Dördantider, Eternetsantitrans, the first radio message reached the command ships offshore. Troops scaling bluffs successfully. It was the sentence Eisenhower had prayed to hear. Still, success hung by a thread. Many companies were reduced to a third of their strength. The wounded lay everywhere, calling for medics who could not reach them. Ammunition ran so low that some men scavenged from the fallen, using any rifle they could find that still fired. Yet every yard gained Fed momentum. The German firing slowed, scattered, and finally fractured. Around 10:30, the rising sun broke through the mist, revealing a beach that was no longer a killing ground, but a battlefield in motion. American flags fluttered from the wreckage of landing craft. Smoke drifted inland as tanks and reinforcements began to arrive on the newly cleared exits. At Draw D1 near Vierville, engineers blew gaps through the final minefields. Bulldozers, amphibious monsters nicknamed rhino tanks, crawled ashore and began carving crude roads up the embankments. Behind them came new waves of infantry and supplies. On the German side, command paralysis set in. Major Werner Pluskat of the 352nd Infantry Division, one of the first to spot the Allied fleet at dawn, now watched in disbelief as his division's defense line crumbled. He tried to raise division headquarters. No answer. Tried again. Still silence. The realization dawned. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. By 11:00 a.m., the Americans controlled several footholds on the high ground. From these positions, they could see the full width of Omaha. 6 miles of scarred sand now dotted with wrecks, bodies, and the living still pushing forward. German soldiers began withdrawing toward Colville and Saint-Laurent. Some surrendered outright, raising their hands amid the smoke. Others fought to the last, firing until grenades found them. At 11:30, U.S. units finally linked up between the Vierville and Saint-Laurent sectors. The line, once broken and scattered, had fused into a single advancing front. A few officers paused to look back down the slope. At the sea that had almost swallowed them, what they saw defied belief. The tide had rolled in, covering the scars of the morning. The beach that had been red now gleamed silver under the noon light. By noon, reports filtered through German command channels. Enemy has penetrated defenses. Situation unclear. In bunkers farther inland, officers who had mocked the American capability now faced silence on every frequency. Their maps, marked with firing lines and kill zones, meant nothing. They had underestimated the one factor no doctrine can measure: the refusal to stop. At 12:01 p.m., the last organized resistance on the western sector collapsed. A captured German NCO, his face blackened by soot, muttered to an American interpreter, "You were not supposed to be here. No one could live through that." The amateurs had done the impossible. Omaha Beach, the graveyard of plans, the furnace of courage, now belonged to them. The German laughter that had echoed in briefings and bunkers was gone. In its place lay disbelief, silence, and the distant sound of engines bringing the rest of the Allied army ashore. The beach was theirs. but at a cost that defied numbers. From the cliffs above Omaha, smoke curled into the clear sky of Normandy. The world's largest invasion had survived its bloodiest test. But what that victory meant, and what it cost, would only become clear in the hours that followed. By the evening of June 6th, the once silent bluffs of Normandy were filled with the sound of victory and morning. The sea had turned calm again, washing gently against a shore that only hours earlier had devoured entire companies. Smoke rose from the shattered German bunkers, drifting out toward the horizon where the Allied armada still floated like a moving city. The cost was beyond imagination. At Omaha Beach alone, nearly 2,400 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Some units, like the 116th Infantry's A Company, lost more than two-thirds of their men in the first hour. The sand was littered with the wreckage of invasion. Burned-out landing craft, twisted barbed wire, rifles bent from heat, helmets floating in the shallows. Engineers and medics worked through the night, collecting the wounded, burying the dead in makeshift graves marked with rifles and helmets. Yet even amid the devastation, the mission had succeeded. The beachhead was secure. Reinforcements, tanks, trucks, artillery, poured ashore through the same sectors that had been under fire that morning. Bulldozers flattened the beach obstacles. Supply routes were carved out of craters. Within 24 hours, what had been a killing ground had turned into a functioning base of operations. The 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, shattered but unbroken, now held the ridgeline overlooking the channel. From there, they could see the entire scope of the invasion fleet, a sight so vast it seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. For many soldiers, that view alone was proof that the impossible had been achieved. Inside the German command structure, disbelief quickly turned to panic. In Cayenne, General Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps, received conflicting reports. Some positions were holding, others had gone silent entirely. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, away in Germany for his wife's birthday, could not be reached until late afternoon. By the time he learned what had happened, Omaha Beach was lost. The German 352nd Infantry Division, elite by coastal defense standards, had been effectively destroyed. Entire companies were wiped out or captured. Officers reported being surrounded by Americans, appearing from every direction. The once vaunted Atlantic Wall had cracked, not because its walls were weak, but because its defenders had been forced to fight an enemy that refused to retreat. Berlin's initial propaganda painted the invasion as repelled, but by June the 7th, even Joseph Goebbels's ministry could not hide the truth. The Allies had secured 5 full beachheads. Omaha, the bloodiest of them all, had held firm. In the field hospitals behind the lines, medics worked without rest. Tents overflowed with the wounded. Men with bandaged heads, burned faces, shattered limbs. Chaplains moved between them, whispering prayers in the flickering light of lanterns. On the beach, recovery teams gathered the fallen. The tide had carried many of them back ashore. Their dog tags were recorded, their bodies wrapped in ponchos or tarps. The same surf that had brought them to France now seemed to mourn them in silence. A young private from the 29th Division later wrote, "When the shooting stopped, the strangest thing was the quiet. The quiet was heavier than the noise had been." By nightfall on June 7th, Allied engineers had transformed Omaha into a logistical artery. Supply depots rose where craters had been. Tanks rolled inland toward the hedgerows of Normandy. Generals visited the frontline positions, saluting men still smeared with sand and blood. The success at Omaha, costly beyond measure, meant that the Allies now possessed a continuous line of beachheads from Utah to Sword. A fragile but unbroken bridge to continental Europe had been built, one that could not be undone. On the German side, survivors of the 352nd retreated inland, regrouping in villages and hedgerows. They expected an immediate counterattack, one that never came. The Wehrmacht had lost both its coordination and its faith. For the Americans, the mood was solemn, not triumphant. They had won, but they knew what it had cost. The amateurs had bled themselves into veterans in a single morning. Omaha was no longer a name. It was a wound, carved into the memory of every man who stepped onto that sand. The beach was secure, but the war was far from over. Beyond the bluffs lay the thick bocage country of Normandy, a maze of hedgerows where new battles waited. And as the sun set over the coast, the survivors of Omaha looked inland, knowing that the hardest days still lay ahead. By June 8, 1944, the chaos of D-Day had hardened into purpose. The once fragile foothold at Omaha was now an engine of invasion. Supply ships anchored offshore in endless lines, offloading tanks, trucks, and ammunition onto the newly cleared exits. Engineers built pontoon piers and temporary roads to handle the flood of reinforcements. Over 100,000 troops had landed across all Normandy beaches by the end of the second day. Among them were replacements for shattered companies of the 1st and 29th Divisions, faces fresh with fear, stepping onto sand still marked by blood. Behind them came the tools of permanence, bulldozers, cranes, and fuel trucks. The Allies were not just invading, they were establishing permanence. The coastline of France was no longer German. It was Allied territory, 1 kilometer at a time. From the air, reconnaissance photos showed what German planners had called impossible. 5 separate invasion beaches had fused into one continuous front. From Utah to Sword, the Allies now held nearly 60 miles of coastline, a living artery of men, machines, and momentum. Inside the German command network, the disbelief that began on June 6th turned into chaos. Field Marshal Rommel returned to Normandy on June 7th and drove to the front. What he saw defied every assumption of the Atlantic Wall. Bunkers were silent. Communication posts were gone. His divisions were either in retreat or surrounded. Reports poured in, everyone worse than the last. At Omaha, the 352nd Infantry Division was combat ineffective. At Utah, paratroopers had linked with beach forces. At Gold and Juneau, the British and Canadians were advancing inland. Rommel understood what Berlin refused to admit. The invasion was unstoppable. The only hope, a massive counterattack by armored divisions, was now impossible. Allied air superiority had turned every daylight movement into suicide. German tanks caught on the roads were burned to metal husks by Thunderbolt and Typhoon aircraft. Hitler, still convinced Normandy was a feint, refused to release the panzer reserves around Paris until it was far too late. When they finally moved, the Allies were already miles inland, building the foundation of a new European front. The laughter that had once filled German briefings, mocking soft Americans and inept generals, had turned to disbelief and dread. Omaha was now a word whispered with bitterness. For the Allied soldiers who survived Omaha, the victory came without joy. There were no cheers, no celebrations, only exhaustion and silence. They had seen what courage cost. For many, the trauma of that morning stayed with them for life. War correspondents arriving on June 8th described the beach as a graveyard of the brave. Rows of temporary crosses stretched toward the sea. Helmets rested on rifles, marking the fallen. The contrast between the calm waves and the carnage they had carried was unbearable. Yet from that agony, a strange respect was born, even from the enemy. Captured German officers admitted that Omaha changed their perception of the Americans. One said, "We thought they were boys. That morning, we met soldiers." In that moment, the myth of American amateurism died, not by speeches or propaganda, but by endurance under impossible fire. The success at Omaha ensured the survival of Operation Overlord. Without it, the entire D-Day invasion could have been pushed back into the sea. The British and Canadian landings to the east depended on Omaha's western anchor. By mid-June, the Allies had captured Carentan and linked Omaha with Utah Beach, creating a unified American front. Within weeks, Cherbourg fell, giving the Allies a deep-water port. The liberation of France had begun. In Berlin, Hitler's high command began to fracture. Blame spread like contagion. Rommel accused the Führer of delusion. Hitler accused his generals of cowardice. The myth of German invincibility was breaking, just as the Allies' confidence was rising. From Omaha Beach, the road to Paris, and ultimately to Berlin, had opened. Even weeks after the landings, the beach still carried its scars. Burned-out tanks sat half-buried in sand. Helmets rusted where they had fallen. The tide continued its endless rhythm, washing away footprints but never memory. For the survivors, Omaha was not a victory to boast of. It was a memory to endure. It symbolized everything war demanded and everything freedom cost. As historian Samuel Eliot Morison would later write, Omaha Beach was won not by strategy or firepower, but by the men who refused to die on schedule. They had turned ridicule into respect, disaster into destiny. But the story of Omaha, and the men who rose from it, does not end on June 6th. Its meaning stretches far beyond Normandy, into the moral and strategic legacy of the entire Second World War. When the smoke cleared and the sea turned still again, Omaha Beach looked ordinary. The sand was quiet, the waves gentle, the wind soft, as if the earth itself was trying to forget what had happened there. But history does not forget. Omaha became more than a battlefield. It became a lesson carved in blood and resolve. For the Germans, it shattered the illusion of invincibility, the belief that discipline and fortification alone could hold back a tide of will. For the Allies, it stripped away all pretense of glory. It revealed what victory truly costs. Not medals or parades, but courage measured in silence, fear, and endurance. The men who landed that morning were not conquerors. They were ordinary soldiers, teachers, farmers, clerks, sons. They did not win because they were fearless. They won because they moved forward despite fear. Their victory was not one of strength, but of persistence. From that persistence rose the liberation of Europe. The chain of events that began in the surf of Normandy led to Paris, to Berlin, and finally to the collapse of tyranny itself. But every step of that journey began with the footsteps that refused to stop on Omaha's sand. Today, when the tide recedes, fragments of that morning still appear. Bits of shrapnel, rusted helmets, forgotten medals. They lie beneath the waves as reminders that arrogance can crumble, but courage endures. The German commanders who once mocked the amateurs were long gone by war's end. But the silence of Omaha still answers them. Not with laughter, but with the whisper of the sea, carrying the names of those who never came home. And as the sun sets over the bluffs, that silence speaks the truth the world must never forget. Freedom was bought here, one wave at a time.